Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev, and this video is to help show you how to avoid and how to fix common deployment mistakes when you're deploying to a deployment service like either for a backend like a Render or Heroku, or for front end Vercel, also Render and like Netlify. The one thing you have to know to understand how these services work is that generally what they do is that they're going to clone your repository. Okay, so basically what you're doing is you're saying, hey, I have this Git repository on github.com or GitLab or Bitbucket, and you're going to say, hey, I want to use this repository and I want to deploy the code that is here. And the benefit of using these services is they have this kind of automated process that does it. But again, that automated process requires you to follow some rules because you can't code an automation for every possible setup. So generally what has to happen is that the root of your repo, that means the top level of your repo, okay, and if you're wondering what the top level of your repo is, if you go to the main page of your GitHub repo, that's the root. Those files you see there, that's the root. That the root has to have certain files. So usually for some sort of node project, it's the folder with your package.json. That's where you create the repo. Okay, if it is a Python Django project, it's going to be the folder with the manage.py file. If it's generally, well, every Python project is a little bit different. So other framework is different. So I can't really stereotype more than there. If you're talking about any kind of Ruby project, it's generally going to be where your gem file is, basic. If it was a Rust project, it would be where your cargo.toml is. There's always that file that kind of dictates how your project's put together. Okay, that sort of project organizing file. Okay, that's where your repo should be created. Okay, so that's going to be the fundamental problem I'm trying to solve in this video. So let's just show you an example of the problem. Okay, so what happens is that somebody usually will open up a blank folder saying, hey, I'm going to do a new project. So they open up a blank folder in their VS Code, which is good. Okay, now the first thing you want to avoid is make sure that you're not creating a repo inside of another repo. So before I do anything, when I do a project, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my terminal and I'm going to do a git status. Okay, and I want to make sure that that command fails. Okay, so I should get a fatal error because that tells me that this folder is currently not a Git repository. Okay, because you run into other issues once you start having Git repositories inside of Git repositories. It's not necessarily something you can't do, but it introduces new complications that if you're a newer developer, you do not want to be having to deal with. Okay, submodules and subrepos introduce all sorts of new levels of complexity that we don't want. So generally, one project, one repository. Okay, and then that repository is created when you do the git init. Okay, so when you do this command git init, it creates a repository in the folder where you're currently at. So right now I'm in this bad deployment folder, right? Okay, so I'm like, okay, I'm going to create my repository here because this is my project folder. That's what I'm thinking, okay? So I'm like, okay, git init. Okay, and now a repository has been created, and I go, okay, so I can see that because if I do an ls-la, and again, that's going to list all files, even hidden files. If I hit enter, I see that there's this git folder. That folder is the git repository, okay? So that's basically how git works. It just stores all the information about all those commits you make in this .git folder in that folder, and that's how Git knows that, hey, this folder and below is what this repository is. Okay, that's basically how it works. So people are like, okay, cool, I created my Git repository, but see, they did it too prematurely. Because if I were creating like an Express app, this would be fine, because I'm probably going to do an npm init in this folder, it's going to create a package.json in this folder, and I'm good to go. But for something like React, what's going to happen is I'm generally going to do something like npx create React app at latest. We'll call the project cheese. Okay, so notice that it's not creating all my React files in this folder. It's creating a whole new folder called cheese. So the problem is the package.json isn't in this folder here. It's which is the folder that my terminal is in, it's inside this new folder called cheese. That's where my package.json is. That's the folder I should have done the git init in, but I did the git init prematurely before I was all set up, okay, or I just made it in the wrong place, okay? So let's just let that create, but now let's pretend that everything is all going fine and I haven't really thought about this. So I'm gonna head over to Chrome. Let me just open up a Chrome. And I'm gonna head over to GitHub and I'm gonna make a repository. I'm gonna say, okay, hey, you know, I'm gonna create a new repository. We'll call it bad deployment lesson. Okay, I create this repository and I'm like, okay, hey, here's where I'm gonna push up my code. I add this repository as a remote. Okay, so I'm waiting for this React thing to kind of finish because it generally always takes a while. So I will pause the recording until that finishes. Okay, so that finished. So there's my React project. Oh, I thought it was finished. Okay. Oh, I think it's just about done. And done. Almost done, maybe. Done. Okay. So now what I do is I connect the remote repo. But notice again, see the folder I'm in is this folder called bad deployment, not the cheese folder, because I originally created this bad deployment folder. This blank folder is when I started, not forgetting that create React app already creates another folder for me. Same thing with like Django. Django's going to create another folder for you. Ruby on Rails. A lot of these frameworks, they generally have a project generator that creates a folder. So you have to take that into account, that you don't want to initialize the repo in the folder above it, but in that folder that is going to be created. Okay, that's where the repo belongs. So, so basically what happens here is I push this up, okay, and so I attach the remote, and I'm going to push up the code. So I'm going to say, like, I'm just going to use my shortcut command that I created. Update origin main. Again, this is not a Git lesson, so I'm not going to get too deep into that. Okay, but now if I go to this repository, look what happens. When I see the root of my repo, do I see the package.json? No. Okay, see, this is my root. This is the front page of my repo. It's not a subfolder. Now, if I go inside this folder, yeah, there's my package.json. But Netlify is not going to see that. Vercel's not going to see that. I mean, you can make it see that, but it requires extra configuration. And again, if you're a new developer, you've just added extra steps for yourself. Okay? So what you want is that package.json to be here in the root of the repo. Oh, how do I fix that? Okay? So we want to fix this. Okay? It's not a hard thing to fix. But again, generally when you make this mistake, you're probably a newer developer, so fixing it is tricky because you're probably still trying to get comfortable with Git. Okay? Now, what you do, okay, is I'm gonna find the folder with the repo. Okay, so let's pretend that I was in that cheese folder. CD cheese. Okay, what I would do is I would do a git status. Okay, or actually what I would do is I would do an ls-la. And I'm going to take a look. Hey, is the Git folder in here? I don't see a Git folder. I see my Git ignored. That doesn't count. It's a .git folder. It's not here. So then I'm going to go up a folder. So cd ... to go up a folder. And then I'm going to do ls-la again to see, hey, is the folder there? And there it is. I realize, oh, it's one folder above. So what I want to do is get rid of that folder. Okay? That's what I want to do. So the command I'm going to do is rm. That's the bash command to remove something. So if I was removing a single file, I could just be like remove, file.txt and remove that file. But I don't want to remove a file. I want to remove a whole folder. So it has to repeat itself. It has to remove the folder and all the files in it. That's a repetitive or recursive process. So what I got to do is do rm and pass this rf flag, which just basically tells it to delete a folder. And then I have to give it the name of the folder that I want to delete. And it has to be in that same folder. So I have to be in the folder where the folder is. And I know that sounds kind of weird when I say it, but that's what you got to do. I got to be in the folder where the .git folder is. So I got to figure that out first. That's where the ls-la comes in. So I can go in each folder and run my ls-la to see what's inside of there. Once I find it, then I can run this command, rm-rf.git. Okay, and that's going to, that's going to remove it when I run it. So see, I get no error, so that means it worked. Then if I do ls-la again, I'll notice, hey, look, the folder is gone. So now I can cd back into that cheese folder, and then just before I make my repo, I'm gonna just double check, is this the folder with the package.json? Yeah, there it is. There's my folder with the package.json. That's the folder I want to make the repo in. So then I can just do git init, and then, but this is a whole new repo. I just created a whole new fresh repo. So that means I'm going to have to reconnect the remote repository. So I'm going to go grab the URL for the repository here from GitHub, copy that, do a git remote add origin, and then paste the URL. Okay, good. And then I have to, commit everything. So git add dot to add all the files to staging, git commit -m with some sort of message, first commit. Okay, so far so good. And then I push it up, git push origin main. Oh, I get an error. So notice like, hey, there's an error here. If I look at this, oh no, what happened? It's saying is because the commit histories don't match. The problem is like when I created a whole new repository, it's creating a whole new chain of commits that don't match the commits that I had already pushed up. Okay, they're two conflicting histories. I don't care about the one that's on GitHub. I just want to erase that. I just want this, the one that I have locally, to be my new history. So the way you do that is when I do git push origin main, if I add the force flag to it, it's going to take whatever I have locally and erase everything that's online and replace it with it. Okay, so only do that if you're really sure you know what you're doing and you know that you want to erase everything that's currently online. Okay, because there's no undo. Okay, you erase it, it's gone. Okay, so git push origin force. I do that, it pushes it. See, no resistance. See, no yellow text. Okay, just is all successful. Do always read your terminal output. Don't just take for granted what your output spits out at you. Okay, because as a developer, you need to get used to reading the output, and the only way to get used to it is to read it, even if you feel not comfortable with what it's saying, because you will get more comfortable with it over time. But if you just ignore it and don't like take a second to kind of meditate on what this is saying, okay, you will never get good at it. Okay, so just take the time to read the output of the console. Okay, it's one of the most important things. But now if I go back to GitHub and I refresh the page, that looks better. See, now the root of my repo has the package.json in it. This is how it should look like when I go to the main repo page. Okay, so then that goes again for any language, any framework. If you're using a automated service, now again, if you're creating your own server from scratch, like you're getting a blank virtual computer from AWS and building out your server, you can do whatever you want. Okay, but it's a lot more work and there's a lot more steps involved in setting all that up. But that's why services like Netlify, Heroku, Vercel, etc. make life so much easier for you because they automate a lot of that pain away. But the price is you have to make sure that you give them your code structured in a way that they know what to do with it. Okay? So you've got to really be critical and think critically about where you initialize your repo, where your files are, so that way that deployment service can figure out what's going on with your code. Because again, everything is relative. Okay? It's going to run commands like your build command, your start command, relative to the root folder by default. You can change that, but again, that requires you to think about changing that. Let's avoid the thinking. Okay? So hopefully you find this helpful. My name is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. Make sure you subscribe, like the video. I'll see you all later. Have a great day and enjoy.